the Americans knew something significant was coming. An intelligence officer named Major James Cogswell had intercepted fragmentary Japanese communications that suggested a final attack was being planned. More tellingly, Japanese artillery had gone silent, strongly suggesting they were conserving ammunition for a final barrage. Forward observers reported unusual movement in the Japanese lines after darkness fell. What the American forces didn't yet know was the full scale of what was being prepared, but they understood enough to be ready. What the Japanese forces didn't know as they formed up in the darkness was that they were walking into the most sophisticated killing system ever devised by military science. The American artillery deployed on Saipan represented overwhelming firepower, organized with scientific precision. The available artillery included 4 Marine artillery battalions equipped with 105mm howitzers, totaling 48 guns. There were 2 Marine artillery battalions with 155mm howitzers, adding 24 guns to the total. 3 Army artillery battalions contributed another 36 guns of 155mm howitzers. 1 Army artillery battalion provided 12 guns of 155mm artillery pieces. Beyond these were dozens of 81mm mortars, organic to the infantry battalions. Naval gunfire support was available from 6 battleships and 8 cruisers positioned offshore. In total, over 150 artillery tubes were available, not even counting the mortars and naval guns. These batteries were connected by redundant communication systems that ensured reliability. Primary radio networks provided the main communications, with backup wire lines available if radio failed, and emergency runners prepared as a final backup. Every infantry battalion had trained forward observers who knew how to call in and adjust fire. Every battery had surveyed its position to within inches of accuracy. Every gun had registered on pre-planned targets, meaning they had already fired test rounds to confirm their accuracy for specific map locations. The entire system could mass fire on a single target or engage multiple targets simultaneously without confusion. Colonel Louis Metzger, commanding the 10th Marine Artillery Regiment, had spent 3 weeks perfecting the fire plan for the island. His operations officer, Major Thomas Warnham, had divided the entire island into numbered squares on a master grid map. Each battery had pre-calculated firing data for every square in their assigned sector. When a forward observer called for fire on grid 164-223, every battery already knew the range and deflection needed, eliminating precious seconds from the response time. At exactly 04:45 hours on July 7, 1944, approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers and armed civilians began moving forward into the darkness. The National World War II Museum's detailed account, based on official Marine Corps records, confirms this as the largest Banzai charge witnessed throughout the entire Pacific War. The leading elements included remnants of the 136th Infantry Regiment from the 43rd Division, naval personnel from the destroyed Saipan Naval Base, and aviation mechanics who barely knew how to use rifles properly. The wounded hobbled forward on crutches, absolutely determined to die with honor according to their understanding of Bushido. The Japanese forces moved through the Tanapag Plain Valley toward a 500-yard gap that existed between the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division. As they advanced through the darkness, they began their traditional battle cries. The word Banzai echoed thousands of times across the valley. The sound of thousands of voices crying out in unison created an otherworldly effect that chilled even veteran Marines who had heard such sounds before. The echo off the valley walls amplified the psychological impact, making the approaching force seem even larger and more terrifying than it already was. Corporal Whelan, hidden in his observation post on a ridge overlooking the valley, was already on his radio transmitting critical information. He called in a fire mission for grid 164-223, reporting enemy infantry in the open with an estimated regiment strength moving south. He requested immediate suppression. The response came within seconds from the 10th Marines Fire Direction Center, demonstrating the efficiency of the system. They acknowledged the grid location and confirmed a time-on-target mission with all available batteries. They informed Whelan that splash, meaning impact, would occur in 90 seconds. What happened next was the product of 2 years of American refinement in the art of coordinated fires. Within the Fire Direction Center, a choreographed dance of calculation began immediately. The target grid was plotted on the master chart with precision. Distance and direction from each battery were measured with specialized instruments. Corrections for current weather conditions were applied to the calculations. Time-on-target missions represented the pinnacle of artillery coordination. Instead of batteries firing when ready, which would create a rolling barrage that gave enemies time to take cover, every battery calculated precisely when to fire so their shells would arrive at exactly the same moment. Batteries positioned farther away from the target fired first. Those closer to the target fired later. The result was that dozens or even hundreds of shells would suddenly materialize out of the sky simultaneously, giving absolutely no warning to those on the receiving end. At exactly 0447 hours, just 2 minutes after the Japanese assault began, the sky above the advancing Japanese formations erupted with devastating force. The official Marine Corps history records that the initial barrage included shells from 12 artillery battalions plus naval gunfire support from the ships offshore. The effect on the densely packed Japanese formation was absolutely catastrophic. The first shells created massive explosions that tore through the advancing ranks. Bodies were thrown into the air by the blast effects. The survivors, stunned and disoriented, nevertheless continued forward. This was the essence of Banzai philosophy, to continue despite impossible odds, to advance until death claimed you. The survivors picked their way through the bodies of their fallen comrades, still screaming their battle cries of Banzai and Totsugeki, which meant charge. Corporal Whelan continued calling in adjustments to the artillery fire. He reported that the barrage needed to drop 200 yards and shift left 100 yards. He informed the FDC that enemy infantry was continuing their advance and requested a repeat of the fire mission. What distinguished American artillery in 1944 from all previous wars was this ability to maintain continuous adjusted fire while enemy forces were actually moving. Forward observers didn't just call in a single barrage and hope for the best. They watched the fall of shot carefully, called in precise corrections, and walked the fire through enemy formations as they moved. The fire direction centers had developed a system called ladder fire, specifically designed to counter Banzai charges. As the Japanese forces advanced, the artillery would fire a line of shells across their front, then systematically walk the barrage backward through their ranks, then forward again, then backward again, like a giant scythe cutting through wheat. This technique maximized casualties by repeatedly hitting the same area from different directions. By 0530 hours, the main Japanese charge had advanced only 400 yards at devastating cost. Bodies carpeted the valley floor in grotesque displays. The wounded crawled over the dead, still trying to advance toward their objective. Some groups took cover in ravines and defiles, seeking any protection from the relentless shelling. Forward observers spotted these groups and called in airbursts, artillery shells designed to explode above ground, that turned these supposed safe positions into death traps. As devastating as the artillery bombardment was, the sheer number of Japanese attackers meant that some soldiers inevitably pushed through the wall of fire. By 0600 hours, scattered groups had managed to reach the main American defense line. The 105th Infantry Regiment bore the brunt of this assault. The 2 forward battalions would suffer 406 men killed and 512 wounded, representing nearly 80% casualties according to National World War II museum records. This was where the American integration of direct and indirect fire support showed its full potential and flexibility. Every Marine rifle company had 60mm mortars organic to its weapons platoon. Every battalion had 81mm mortars available. These lighter weapons could engage targets that were too close for artillery, inside what was called the danger close range, where friendly fire became a significant risk. The mortar crews worked frantically to support the infantry fighting at close quarters. At 06:15 hours, the largest remaining cohesive group of Japanese soldiers, approximately 600 men, succeeded in penetrating the American line and actually overran artillery positions belonging to the 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines. The artillery crews, trained for just such an emergency, removed the firing locks from their howitzers to prevent their use by the enemy and fought as infantry with their personal weapons. Some batteries made the desperate decision to depress their gun barrels to minimum elevation and fired point-blank into the charging Japanese soldiers at ranges measured in tens of yards rather than miles. When Japanese reserves were spotted forming for a potential second-wave attack, the call went out for naval gunfire. The request specified grid 159-215 with troops in the open as the target. Official naval records show that USS Tennessee alone fired 293 rounds of 14-inch ammunition during the overall engagement, while USS Louisville contributed 322 rounds of 8-inch shells. These massive projectiles, each weighing hundreds of pounds, had devastating effects on any concentration of troops. By 07:30 hours, the organized Banzai charge had completely degenerated into isolated groups of Japanese soldiers trying desperately to find any way through the American defensive lines. The carefully planned human wave attack had been utterly shattered by the coordinated firepower of modern industrial warfare. Small groups of 5 to 20 soldiers would periodically emerge from whatever cover they had found, scream their Banzai battle cry, and charge the nearest American position in futile attacks. The American artillery had shifted to what was called harassing and interdiction fire. This consisted of random barrages placed on likely assembly areas and routes of movement to prevent the Japanese from reorganizing their scattered forces. Every few minutes, a valley or ravine would suddenly erupt in explosions, as artillery methodically denied the enemy any safe ground where they might regroup. The most tragic phase of the battle began around 900 hours, when Japanese wounded who couldn't walk began their own desperate actions. According to multiple eyewitness accounts that were later documented in official histories, men who had lost a leg hopped forward on crutches while holding grenades in their free hand. Soldiers with severe wounds crawled toward American lines, pushing their rifles ahead of them through the dirt, determined to kill at least one more enemy before they died. The chaos and ferocity of the Banzai charge produced 3 Medal of Honor recipients, whose actions are thoroughly documented in official citations that tell stories of extraordinary courage. Lieutenant Colonel William J. O'Brien, commanding the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry, refused evacuation despite being wounded. When Japanese forces overran his command post, he mounted a jeep-mounted 50-caliber machine gun and directed its fire against the enemy while completely exposed. After expending all available ammunition, he fought with 2 pistols until he was killed. His body was later found surrounded by at least 30 dead Japanese soldiers. His Medal of Honor citation, signed by President Truman on May 27, 1945, details his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in the face of overwhelming odds. Private Thomas A. Baker, serving with Company A, 105th Infantry, destroyed a Japanese strongpoint using a bazooka, then fought off multiple attacks throughout the morning, personally killing at least 24 enemy soldiers. When he was severely wounded and unable to walk, he absolutely refused evacuation. His famous last words to his comrades have been recorded as, "Get the hell away from me." When his position was eventually recaptured, Baker was found dead, propped against a tree with an empty 45 caliber pistol still in his hand, and 8 dead Japanese soldiers arranged around him where they had fallen. His Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously on May 9, 1945. Captain Benjamin L. Salomon, serving as battalion surgeon for the 2nd Battalion, 105th Infantry, was treating wounded soldiers when Japanese soldiers suddenly entered his aid station. He killed 4 attackers with his rifle, then ordered all the wounded evacuated while he covered their withdrawal with a machine gun. His body was later found slumped over the weapon, with 98 dead Japanese soldiers counted in front of his position. Medical examination revealed he had suffered 76 bullet wounds and 24 bayonet wounds before he finally died. Due to Geneva Convention questions about medical personnel bearing arms in combat, his Medal of Honor wasn't approved until May 1, 2002, nearly 60 years after his sacrifice. As full daylight came to Saipan at 1000 hours, the full extent of the slaughter became clearly visible across the battlefield. Official body count teams, working over the following days, would eventually document 4,311 Japanese dead from the charge itself. American casualties totaled approximately 1,000 killed and wounded, with the 105th Infantry Regiment essentially destroyed as a fighting unit and needing to be rebuilt. The mathematics of the engagement were stark and brutal. The American artillery had fired approximately 12,000 rounds during the 15-hour battle. The fire direction centres had successfully coordinated fires from 18 separate artillery battalions plus naval gunfire support from multiple ships. The system had functioned exactly as it had been designed to function. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Walt, observing the aftermath of the battle, wrote in his official report that the enemy had attacked with great courage but without modern tactical sense. He noted that their fire support system had functioned exactly as designed, that the forward observers had performed magnificently, and that the fire direction centres had never missed a beat throughout the entire engagement. As the sun climbed higher in the tropical sky, American graves registration teams began the grim work of collecting and identifying bodies. The scale of death was unprecedented in the Pacific War up to that point. Major Edward McCarthy, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 105th Infantry, one of the units that bore the brunt of the attack, described the scene in his after-action report. He compared it to looking like a cattle stampede from a Western movie, except that the Japanese forces just kept on coming wave after wave, despite the impossible odds and the horrific casualties they were suffering. Among the American lines, the psychological impact of what they had witnessed was profound. Many Marines and soldiers had witnessed death before in previous battles, but nothing on this particular scale. The systematic destruction of thousands of human beings, no matter how militarily necessary it might have been, left deep impressions on those who witnessed it. Captain Edmund G. Love, the 27th Division historian who would later write extensively about the battle, interviewed survivors immediately after the action concluded. His notes, which are preserved in the National Archives, capture the raw emotions of the moment. He recorded that men who had been through everything in previous campaigns were visibly shaken. Not by fear, he noted, because the Japanese forces never really had a realistic chance of breaking through. Rather, they were shaken by the sheer scale of the killing they had participated in. The Japanese survivors melted back into the caves in northern Saipan to continue resistance. Among them was Captain Sakai Oba, who would lead guerrilla resistance operations for another 16 months before finally surrendering in December 1945, a full 3 months after Japan's official capitulation. His survival and continued resistance are thoroughly documented in military records and in the book titled Oba, The Last Samurai, Saipan, 1944–45. General Saito, who had ordered the disastrous charge, committed seppuku ritual suicide on July 10, 1944, 3 days after the failed assault he had commanded. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the former commander of the Pearl Harbor attack force, had already taken his own life on July 6, the day before the charge occurred. Their deaths marked the effective end of organized Japanese resistance on Saipan, though scattered holdouts would continue fighting for months. The Battle of Saipan's Banzai charge showcased revolutionary developments in military technology and doctrine that would influence warfare for decades to come. The Fire Direction Center system, originally developed at Fort Sill in the 1930s, had transformed artillery from an art form relying on individual skill and experience into a rigorous science based on mathematical procedures and standardized methods. Instead of individual battery commanders making decisions based on gut instinct and personal experience, Trained specialists now use mathematical procedures to optimize every single aspect of fire support operations. The system included graphical firing tables that eliminated the need for complex manual calculations, standard radio procedures that minimized communication time and prevented misunderstandings, and pre-surveyed battery positions that were accurate to within 1 meter. Meteorological sections provided hourly weather updates that were factored into firing calculations, while registration procedures accounted for barrel wear and variations in ammunition performance. Time-on-target missions, which were a uniquely American capability at that time, demonstrated the absolute pinnacle of this level of coordination. Multiple batteries would calculate backward from a desired impact time, with individual guns firing in a carefully calculated sequence so that all shells would arrive at the target simultaneously, despite traveling different distances. This technique, which was impossible without precise communication and calculation capabilities, multiplied both the psychological and physical impact of artillery fire by eliminating any warning of incoming rounds. Japanese military leadership had actually received warnings about American artillery capabilities well before the Saipan battle, but they had chosen to ignore these warnings. Japanese officers who had observed German Wehrmacht operations in Europe had filed reports about American fire support doctrine and its effectiveness. Military attachés stationed in neutral countries had forwarded detailed reports about American industrial production of artillery ammunition, which was producing millions of rounds per month. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, operations officer for the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa, had carefully studied American tactics and had explicitly warned against launching Banzai charges against such firepower. In pre-war planning sessions, Yahara had argued forcefully that massed infantry attacks against modern firepower were nothing less than suicidal. He was consistently overruled by more senior generals who believed that spiritual power and Japanese fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. This represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern warfare actually functioned. The Banzai charges revealed fatal flaws in Japanese racial ideology that had been promoted throughout their military. The belief that Americans were soft, materialistic, and incapable of sustained combat had been drummed into every Japanese soldier through their training and indoctrination. They were repeatedly told that Americans would break and run when faced with determined Japanese warriors exhibiting what they called Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan. This racism, it should be noted, cut both ways in its effects. American forces, who had initially been terrified by Banzai charges in the early battles of 1942, had by 1944 come to see them as evidence of Japanese irrationality and poor tactical thinking. The charges reinforced American stereotypes about their enemy that would influence strategic decisions throughout the remainder of the war, including the ultimate decision to use atomic weapons. The American response to Banzai charges, emphasizing overwhelming firepower rather than meeting the charges head-on with countercharges, reflected both tactical wisdom and fundamental cultural differences in how the two sides approached warfare. Americans fundamentally approached war as a problem to be solved through the application of technology and organizational efficiency. The Japanese approached it as a test of spiritual strength and warrior virtue. When these two radically different philosophies collided on the battlefield, technology consistently won. The Saipan Banzai charge represented the culmination of 2 full years of American learning and adaptation in the Pacific Theater. In early 1942, American forces had often been caught off guard by Japanese tactics that were unfamiliar and psychologically intimidating. By mid-1944, they had developed highly specific counter-doctrines that actually turned Japanese strengths into fatal weaknesses. This evolution can be traced through after-action reports from various battles. At Guadalcanal in August 1942, the reports noted that enemy night attacks had achieved initial success through surprise and sheer aggression and recommended improved night defensive procedures. At New Georgia in July 1943, The reports observed that coordinated defensive fires broke up most enemy charges and that units with registered artillery support suffered minimal casualties. At Tarawa in November 1943, reports stated that time-on-target missions proved highly effective against massed enemy troops and recommended that all forward observers be trained in TOT procedures. By Saipan in July 1944, the report stated simply that the enemy Banzai attack had been completely destroyed by coordinated fires and recommended no changes to existing doctrine. American troops, who had initially been deeply unnerved by the sight and sound of screaming Japanese soldiers charging with fixed bayonets, had learned through experience to see these attacks as golden opportunities for destruction rather than serious threats. The decision by General Saito to launch the Banzai charge on Saipan represented a catastrophic failure of Japanese military leadership at the highest levels. Saito himself knew the attack would fail. His final messages clearly indicated this was understood to be a death ride rather than a viable military operation. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, the commanding general of the 5th Amphibious Corps, analysed the Japanese decision in his memoir with barely concealed bewilderment. He wrote that from any military standpoint, the Banzai charge was absolutely insane. He noted that the Japanese had strong defensive positions available in northern Saipan's extensive network of caves and ravines. They could have conducted a fighting withdrawal that would have cost American forces thousands of casualties and bought valuable time for homeland defenses. Instead, they deliberately came out into the open terrain where American firepower advantage was absolutely overwhelming. The Japanese military's consistent inability to adapt to modern firepower stemmed from institutional and cultural factors that prioritized spiritual values over material reality. Officers who suggested defensive tactics or fighting withdrawals were labeled as cowards and faced severe professional and social consequences. The result of this inflexible mindset was tactical suicide conducted on a massive scale throughout the Pacific War. The American artillery system that destroyed the Saipan Banzai charge had incorporated multiple technological innovations that gave it overwhelming advantages. Radio communications represented a crucial element. The SCR 300 and SCR 610 FM radios used by forward observers provided clear, static-free communications even in the electromagnetic chaos of a battlefield, with thousands of explosions and electrical disturbances. With an effective range of 3 to 5 miles, these radios allowed observers to communicate with multiple FDCs simultaneously without confusion. Survey equipment represented another critical advantage. American artillery units deployed with the latest survey equipment available, which they used to establish battery positions with unprecedented accuracy. These battery positions were tied into a common grid system that allowed any observer anywhere on the battlefield to call for fire from any battery without requiring complex calculations or adjustments. Meteorological support provided yet another edge. Each artillery regiment maintained a dedicated meteorological section that released weather balloons every 6 hours to measure wind speed and direction at various altitudes. This data was absolutely crucial for accurate long-range fire, as wind could push shells significantly off course. Fire control instruments gave American gunners speed and precision. The M7 graphical firing table and M10 plotting board allowed FDCs to track multiple targets and friendly unit positions simultaneously, solving complex firing problems in seconds rather than the minutes required by older methods. The destruction of the Saipan Banzai charge carried strategic implications that extended far beyond the island itself. When word reached Tokyo that over 4,000 soldiers had died in a single charge while inflicting minimal American casualties, it contributed significantly to the fall of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government on July 18, 1944. The fall of Saipan itself brought American B-29 bombers within 1,250 miles of Tokyo, placing the Japanese homeland within range of sustained strategic bombing. By November 1944, heavy bombers were launching regularly from Saipan's rebuilt airfields to strike industrial and population centers in Japan. Admiral Osami Nagano would later state bluntly that their war was lost with the loss of Saipan, acknowledging the strategic disaster the defeat represented. Despite the obvious futility that had been demonstrated at Saipan, Japanese forces would continue to launch more Banzai charges at subsequent battles on Guam, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each ended in similar slaughter with minimal tactical gain. The institutional refusal to adapt to modern warfare realities would ultimately cost Japan hundreds of thousands of lives that were thrown away in tactically useless attacks. 9 months after Saipan, at Okinawa in May 1945, the final evolution of American counter-Banzai tactics was displayed with even more devastating effectiveness. When the Japanese 32nd Army launched desperate charges on May 4th, the results proved even more lopsided than those at Saipan. The May 4th counter-offensive saw 5,000 Japanese soldiers attack American defensive lines. Within just 6 hours of fighting, 4,500 of them were dead. The Americans suffered 335 casualties in comparison. The kill ratio of nearly 15-1 demonstrated the absolute dominance of coordinated firepower over human wave attacks in modern warfare. By the time of the Okinawa campaign, the Americans had added several new elements to their already formidable system. These included improved white phosphorus shells for marking targets and creating psychological effects, better integration between Marine and Army artillery units that had sometimes been problematic earlier in the war, and continuous wave radar systems for tracking enemy movement during night operations. The efficiency of American artillery in systematically destroying Banzai charges raised profound philosophical questions about the nature of modern warfare. The industrial-scale slaughter of brave but tactically misguided soldiers, while militarily necessary for victory, troubled many American participants who had witnessed it firsthand. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers, whose battalion had helped repel the Saipan charge, wrote thoughtfully in his personal papers about the moral dimensions of what they had accomplished. He stated that there was no glory in what they had done that night. They had killed thousands of brave men who never really had a chance of success. Yes, he acknowledged, these men were trying to kill Americans. Yes, it was militarily necessary to stop them. But turning artillery into what amounted to an assembly line of death was not warfare as their fathers had known it in previous conflicts. The one-sided nature of the killing, made possible by American technological and organizational superiority, represented a fundamentally new kind of warfare where individual courage alone meant absolutely nothing when confronted with coordinated firepower. The artillery techniques that were perfected against Japanese Banzai charges would go on to influence military doctrine for many decades after World War II ended. The fire direction center concept became standard practice in all modern armies around the world. Time-on-target missions transitioned from an American specialty to routine training in most professional militaries. The integration of forward observers directly with infantry units became established doctrine that continues to this day. In Korea, just 5 years later, American forces would use essentially identical techniques to destroy Chinese human wave attacks that employed very similar tactics to the Japanese. At the Battle of Chipyong-ni in February 1951, American artillery destroyed an entire Chinese division that attempted a night assault. The Chinese forces, like the Japanese before them, learned through bitter experience that courage and numerical superiority could not overcome properly coordinated firepower backed by industrial production. The Vietnam War saw further refinement of these basic concepts with the addition of computers for fire control calculations and helicopter-borne forward observers who could direct fire from the air. The Gulf War in 1991 showcased GPS-guided artillery shells that could hit targets with incredible precision. But the fundamental concept underlying all these advances, that of massed coordinated fires directed by trained forward observers, remained essentially unchanged from what had been perfected at Saipan 50 years earlier. Decades after the battle, American veterans of Saipan reflected on their experiences during anniversary commemorations. At the 50th anniversary event in 1994, survivors gathered to remember that terrible morning and to honor both their fallen comrades and the enemy soldiers who had fought with such futile courage. Arthur Robinson, who had been a private with the 105th Infantry and had survived the charge, recalled the emotional complexity of the experience. He explained that people needed to understand they didn't want to kill all those Japanese soldiers. But the enemy forces kept coming in wave after wave. The American artillery simply cut them down in massive numbers. He described it as horrible, but questioned what choice they really had when faced with such an attack. The efficiency of the killing haunted many participants for the rest of their lives. They had won not through demonstrating superior personal courage or individual fighting skill, but through possessing superior systems and overwhelming firepower. It was victory without the traditional glory of close combat. It was success without the satisfaction that comes from overcoming a worthy opponent on equal terms. The destruction of the Japanese Banzai charge on Saipan demonstrated that scientific management of violence, with centralized planning, redundant communications, and integrated fire direction centers, represented the application of industrial management techniques to warfare itself. The Japanese Banzai charge, with its roots in samurai warrior tradition and Shinto religious beliefs about honorable death in combat, belonged to an earlier era of warfare. When confronted with American artillery doctrine as it existed in 1944, such tactics amounted to nothing more than mass suicide disguised as military operations. The Saipan Banzai charge taught crucial lessons, but tragically only one side survived to learn and apply them properly. For the Americans, the battle validated their substantial investment in artillery systems and fire control technology. The demonstrated ability to mass fires from multiple batteries onto a single target within seconds of a call for fire had proven absolutely decisive. For Japan, whatever lessons might have been learned came far too late to matter. Some individual Japanese officers did learn from these disasters and adapted their tactics accordingly. On Iwo Jima and later at Okinawa, generals like Tadamichi Kuribayashi and Mitsuru Ushijima largely avoided large-scale Banzai charges, instead fighting defensive battles designed to maximize American casualties through attrition. But these adaptive commanders were exceptions rather than the rule. The institutional Japanese military never formally abandoned the Banzai charge as doctrine. Captain Sakai Oba, who survived by deliberately avoiding participation in the main charge and instead conducting guerrilla operations, would later reflect on what they learned that terrible night. He stated that they discovered courage without modern technology was essentially meaningless in modern industrial warfare. The Americans, he noted, didn't actually defeat Japanese spirit or bravery. They simply made such qualities completely irrelevant to the outcome of battles. The final accounting of the Saipan Banzai charge reveals the stark mathematics of industrial warfare applied to human conflict. Japanese casualties included 4,311 confirmed killed in action. The number of wounded remains unknown because most died subsequently from their injuries. Total Japanese participants numbered approximately 4,000 to 4,300 soldiers and civilians. Their casualty rate approached 100%. American casualties painted a different picture. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry suffered 406 killed and 512 wounded. The 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines, suffered 127 casualties. Total American casualties across all engaged units numbered approximately 1,000. The casualty rate for directly engaged American units reached 40%, which was severe but survivable for the units involved. Ammunition expenditure told its own story. An estimated 12,000 plus artillery rounds were fired. Thousands of mortar rounds were expended. Naval gunfire contributed 615 major caliber shells that were specifically documented. The cost effectiveness worked out to approximately 3 artillery shells expended per Japanese casualty, a ratio that demonstrated both the destructiveness of modern weapons and the efficiency of the fire control system. These numbers collectively tell a story of industrial efficiency applied to human destruction on a massive scale. The Americans had essentially turned warfare into a mathematical equation where firepower multiplied by coordination reliably equaled victory. The Saipan Banzai charge raises philosophical questions that remain relevant to understanding modern warfare and its implications. Is there still a meaningful place for individual human courage in industrialized combat? Can technology completely negate the human element in war? Does the very efficiency of modern killing diminish the humanity of those who conduct such operations? Modern American military doctrine, fundamentally shaped by experiences like Saipan and countless subsequent conflicts, continues to emphasize overwhelming firepower and technological superiority as the path to victory. The explicit goal remains to win battles with minimal friendly casualties, even if achieving that goal means inflicting massive enemy casualties. This approach has proven consistently effective across decades of conflicts, but it continues to raise difficult moral questions about the nature of warfare in the industrial and post-industrial age. The destruction of the Japanese Banzai charge on Saipan marked the definitive end of an entire era in warfare. Never again would military forces anywhere launch massed infantry charges against modern firepower while reasonably expecting anything but complete annihilation. The romantic notion of the grand charge, whether cavalry with raised sabres or infantry with fixed bayonets, died permanently on Tanapag Plain under the crushing weight of American artillery fire. What emerged from all the smoke and carnage of that night was a fundamentally new understanding of warfare as an industrial process rather than a test of warrior virtue. Victory would consistently go not to the bravest soldiers or the most skilled individual warriors, but rather to those nations and armies with the best systems. These systems included fire control systems, communication systems, and logistical systems that could sustain operations. The human element certainly remained important in modern warfare, but it had become clearly subordinate to technological and organizational superiority. The Japanese soldiers who charged into American artillery on July 7, 1944, were genuinely among the last military forces anywhere to believe that spiritual strength and warrior courage could overcome material disadvantage in battle. Their deaths proved conclusively that in modern warfare, courage alone is simply not enough to achieve victory. The American artillery system that destroyed them so efficiently represented the actual future of warfare, a future that was coordinated, carefully calculated, and crushingly efficient in its application of violence. The 4,311 Japanese soldiers who died in that charge displayed extraordinary personal courage that deserves recognition. They deserved far better than to be fed into the mechanical jaws of American artillery fire. But their commanders, blinded by rigid ideology and adherence to outdated tradition, sent them to die in a manner that achieved absolutely nothing except to demonstrate the complete obsolescence of their tactical doctrine. Their sacrifice stands as an eternal warning about the dangers of allowing ideology to override military reality. In modern warfare, courage alone is never enough to secure victory. Technology, careful organization, and overwhelming firepower will always defeat human wave attacks, regardless of how brave those individual humans might be. The age of the glorious charge ended permanently on Saipan, killed by American artillery that had transformed warfare from a contest of courage into an exercise in mathematics and applied violence. The Banzai charge itself was utterly obliterated by American artillery coordination. More significantly, the very concept of the Banzai charge was revealed as nothing more than a romantic anachronism in an age thoroughly dominated by industrial warfare. In the Valley of Death on Saipan, traditional courage met modern coordination, warrior spirit met scientific system, and ancient military tradition met contemporary technology. Technology won decisively, as it always does when confronted with outdated tactical thinking, no matter how bravely that thinking might be applied on the battlefield.